So remember, after Joshua led the tribes of Israel into the promised land, he called them to be faithful to their covenant or promise with God by obeying the commands of the Old Testament and the law that God had given them. And God said that if they do this, they will show all the other nations what God is like. So Judges begins with the death of Joshua and basically tells the story of Israel's total failure. The book's name comes from the type of leaders Israel had in this period before they had any kings. They were governed by judges or military leaders, not like in a courtroom. But the book of Judges is a very tragic tale because it tells about Israel's moral corruption. It tells about how they did not follow God. And moral corruption means that they were corrupted inside of their heart. And instead of following God, they decided to blend in with the other nations around them. So in the beginning of the book shows how they did not drive out the Canaanites. And then in the middle of the book, it shows how Israel had judges, and those judges went from being pretty good to worse. And then at the end of the book, it shows how the country as a whole became really, really bad. So while Judges defeated some of the Canaanite towns, there were a lot of towns that they still lived in, and they failed to drive them out. So remember, the point in driving them out was to avoid them being like those other countries, that they would not start worshiping the other gods, and they would not have child sacrifice. God called them to be a holy people, but they didn't do that. They became like the countries around them, and they did the same things that those countries did. And this is part of Israel's history that shows a series of cycles, a downward spiral, and that they became like the Canaanites and would sin against God, and so God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed. The Canaanites, they were oppressed them, and ultimately Israel would see the error of their ways and then repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among them, who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But then, Israel would sin again, and it would all start over. So this sets up this is the setup for the rest of the book. This whole cycle gets repeated for each of the 6 main judges who are told in this book. Now, the first 3 judges were Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah. So either the judge themselves or the people who help the judge defeat the enemies and deliver Israel. The stories about the next 3 judges are longer, and they focus on how they were bad. The judges were actually bad inside their heart. Gideon starts out very well, and he comes to trust that God will save Israel through him, and he defeats the Midianites with about 300 men carrying torches and clay pots. But later, Gideon has a bad temper, and he murders a bunch of other Israelites for not helping him in the battle. And then it all goes downhill from there. He makes an idol from gold that he won in his battles, and after he dies, all the Israelites worship an idol that was made from that gold. And so the cycle continues again. Then the next main judge, who was Jephthah, he wasn't very good either. And things get really bad for Israel. And he was their leader, and he won a bunch of battles. But he also ended up offering his own daughter up for sacrifice if he wins the battle. So he was so far removed, he just didn't know about God's character. So many generations and so many people had gone by that they now no longer remember what God had done for them or the character of God, and they treated God just like he was the same God as the surrounding countries. It shows how far Israel had fallen away from God. Now, the last judge was Samson, and he was actually the worst. His life began full of promise, but he has no regard for God. He is just looking out for himself, really. He was violent and he was very arrogant, and he won many victories over the Philistines, but in his heart, he was not really doing so to follow God. And he ends up dying because of his own lack of morality in his heart had led him astray. And so there were moments in the middle of Judges, all throughout Judges, there were moments when God's Spirit led people and empowered the judges to do great things to deliver them. However, all of these people were really messed up, and they slowly came away from God and were not really worshiping the one true God, but worshiping the way the surrounding people had worshiped other gods. And so it's amazing that God is still so faithful in taking care of his people, even though they have wandered so far away and they have corrupt leaders. But he works with what he has. At this point, at the end of the book, you cannot even tell the difference between the Israelites and the Canaanites. When they first got there to the land after Joshua, God had said for them to be holy and to be different than the people in the surrounding countries. But because they did not do what God had said to do, they ended up becoming just like the people in the other country. Now, the final section of the book of Judges tells two tragic stories. A key line that's shown 4 times at the end of this book is, "In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." So it sets the stage for the following books to show kings actually coming forth from Saul and then David's line. It begins with the book of Ruth, who was actually the grandmother to David, and then paving the way that in the future books, even though there was King David and King Solomon after that, all of that set up the stage that there's no earthly king that could do anything for us that we really needed in our hearts. So we needed Jesus, who is the one true king and the perfect king, to come and save us and do what no other judge and no other king on earth could do for us.